The orange envelope was hanging from my mailbox flag before I even finished my first sip of coffee, and by the time I unfolded the paper inside, I had already been accused of interfering with federal mail delivery, fined $750, and threatened with even more penalties if I didn't move a mailbox that hadn't budged a single inch since the day my house was built. I've learned a lot about people over the years, but one thing still surprises me. Some folks become absolutely fearless the moment they think a clipboard gives them more power than common sense. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all this happened, I figured our little neighborhood outside Henderson, Nevada was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. We had the usual weekend barbecues, kids riding bikes in circles until sunset, retirees arguing about whose tomatoes grew faster, and the occasional complaint about someone leaving their trash cans out too long. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like home. My wife, Claire, always joked that our street looked like it had been copied and pasted 25 times by the same developer. Every house wore the same warm desert colors. Every yard was covered in decorative rock instead of grass, and every mailbox stood in a straight line like soldiers waiting for inspection. Mine sat in front of our driveway with the number 1847 painted neatly across the side. It had been installed 16 years earlier by the original builder, inspected before we ever closed on the house, and accepted without a single complaint through countless mail deliveries, holiday cards, tax returns, birthday packages, and more Amazon boxes than I'd ever admit. That's why the violation notice felt almost ridiculous. It claimed my mailbox was positioned too far from the curb, creating unsafe delivery conditions and delaying postal service. According to the letter, I had 7 days to relocate it or face escalating fines. I actually laughed out loud at first because I honestly thought someone had slipped a prank into my mailbox. Then I noticed the association letterhead, the official signatures, and the line threatening legal action if I failed to comply. The laughter disappeared pretty fast. I emailed the homeowners association before I even left for work. My message wasn't angry. It was simple. I asked them to show me exactly which rule my mailbox violated and how they measured it. 2 days later, they replied with a scanned page that looked like it had been copied so many times the ink was giving up. There was a paragraph about maintaining a uniform appearance throughout the community, but there wasn't a single measurement, diagram, or engineering standard anywhere on the page. It basically said the board could determine what looked acceptable. That answer bothered me more than the fine itself. Rules are one thing. Vague opinions pretending to be rules are something else entirely. Claire read the email over dinner and looked at me across the table. "They're fishing," she said quietly. "They don't actually expect you to question them?" I shrugged and told her maybe it was just one overzealous board member trying to make a name for themselves. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the following Monday, another envelope showed up. This time, the fine had doubled with late fees already attached, even though I was still waiting for clarification. What caught my attention wasn't the money. It was one sentence buried halfway down the page. It claimed the United States Postal Service had submitted complaints regarding my mailbox placement. I read that line 3 times because something about it felt off. My mail carrier, Dave, had been driving the same route for years. We chatted every couple of weeks whenever I happened to be outside. He'd never mentioned a problem. He'd never struggled reaching the box. Heck, he'd even leaned against it while handing me oversized packages. That afternoon, I decided to stop guessing and drive straight to the main post office instead of arguing through emails. The lobby smelled exactly the way every old post office seems to smell: paper, cardboard, dust, and old air conditioning. Behind the counter stood a gray-haired supervisor named Walter, whose name tag looked older than some of the customers waiting in line. I handed him the HOA notice and asked if someone there had filed a complaint against my property. He adjusted his glasses, read every word without saying anything, then looked up at me with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "Son," he said, sliding the paper back toward me, "nobody from this office filed anything about your mailbox." I blinked. "You're sure?" He nodded without hesitation. "I'm positive, and if somebody is using our name to pressure homeowners, That's something I'd like to document. At that exact moment, something shifted inside me. Until then, I'd been trying to solve a misunderstanding. Walking out of that building, I realized I might actually be dealing with something much bigger, and I had a feeling the people running our HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their entire careers. To be continued in part 2. I didn't sleep much that night because once the idea settled into my head that someone on the board had casually dropped the United States Postal Service into an official violation letter without any evidence, the mailbox itself stopped being the issue. It wasn't about $750 anymore, and it certainly wasn't about moving a wooden post 6 inches closer to the curb. It was about trust. Every homeowner in our neighborhood paid dues believing the association would enforce legitimate rules, not invent authority whenever it became convenient. The next morning, Walter called me before I even made it to work. "Mr. Brooks," he said. "I checked with our district office, too. Nobody has ever logged a complaint regarding your address." Then he paused for a second before adding, "Would you like us to put that in writing?" I smiled even though he couldn't see it. "I'd appreciate that more than you know." 3 days later, I was holding an official USPS letter on federal letterhead confirming that my mailbox complied with every applicable postal regulation, including height, setback, carrier access, visibility, and delivery safety. Walter even attached the inspection references they used whenever new developments were approved. Suddenly, I wasn't relying on my memory anymore. I had documents. Real ones. That evening, Claire spread everything across our dining room table while I dug through an old storage cabinet in the garage. Buried inside a faded plastic folder was the original closing package from when we bought the house. Inspection approvals, builder certifications, survey maps, utility records. Then I found something neither of us expected. The developer's final construction approval showing every mailbox location had been reviewed before the subdivision was turned over to the HOA 16 years earlier. Claire looked at me and quietly laughed. "So they approved the exact mailbox they're finding you for." "Looks that way." She leaned back in her chair. "That's almost impressive." Instead of feeling relieved, I actually felt disappointed. Part of me kept hoping this was just a misunderstanding created by sloppy paperwork. But every new document made that explanation harder to believe. A week later, the hearing notice arrived. Attendance mandatory. Failure to appear could result in additional penalties, liens, and legal collection costs. I hired an attorney named Rachel Lawson, not because I expected some dramatic courtroom battle, but because I wanted someone in the room who understood where HOA authority stopped and actual law began. Rachel had spent years dealing with property disputes, and after reading everything I'd collected, she closed the folder and smiled the way surgeons probably smile before routine operations. "Ethan," she said, "they're arguing about something they don't legally control." "You mean the mailbox?" "Exactly. Decorative landscaping? Maybe. Paint color? Possibly under certain covenants. But federal mail delivery equipment? That's an entirely different conversation." Hearing that settled my nerves more than she probably realized. The hearing took place inside the neighborhood clubhouse, a building I'd only ever visited for Christmas parties and annual meetings where people debated pool hours like they were negotiating international peace treaties. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. 3 board members sat behind polished tables wearing matching navy jackets with little association pins on their lapels. Their president, Diane Mercer, occupied the center seat with a thick binder stacked neatly beside her. She greeted me with a smile that somehow managed to feel both polite and rehearsed. "Mr. Brooks," she began, "thank you for attending. We hope this matter can be resolved cooperatively." Rachel whispered. Translation: "They expect you to surrender." I nearly laughed. Diane opened the meeting by repeating the violation notice, almost word for word. According to her, my mailbox disrupted neighborhood uniformity and interfered with efficient mail service. She emphasized that several residents had privately expressed concerns, although she declined to identify any of them. Then she pointed toward a photograph of my mailbox mounted on a presentation board, like it was evidence from a criminal investigation. "The board has determined this installation falls outside acceptable community standards." Rachel waited until Diane finished before calmly sliding Walter's USPS letter across the table. Before discussing appearance, she said, "I'd like the board to read this document." Diane barely glanced at the first paragraph. Federal regulations don't limit our aesthetic authority. Rachel folded her hands together. Actually, they do when you're attempting to regulate the placement of an active mailbox used for United States mail delivery. The room became noticeably quieter. One board member shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another started flipping through the association handbook much faster than before. Diane remained confident, but there was the slightest hesitation before she answered. "Our governing documents authorize us to maintain community standards." Rachel nodded politely. "Within the limits of your jurisdiction." She placed another document beside the first one. Title 39 gives the Postal Service exclusive authority regarding approved mailbox installation for active delivery routes. Your association may recommend cosmetic consistency, but it cannot override federal standards or fabricate postal complaints. Diane's smile finally disappeared. "We're not fabricating anything." Rachel didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Would you like us to contact the Postal Inspection Service to verify that statement?" You could almost hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, one of the older board members quietly asked Diane, "Did we actually receive a complaint from USPS?" Diane hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. "We understood there had been concerns." Rachel gently pushed Walter's signed statement closer to the center of the table. "The district supervisor confirms there were no complaints, no investigations, and no requests involving Mr. Brooks' property." I watched Diane read the letter twice before setting it down without saying a word. Then Rachel produced the original construction approval showing the subdivision developer had installed every mailbox exactly where it remained today, and that the locations had been accepted during final inspection before homeowners ever moved in. Even the board member sitting on the far left let out a slow breath. "So we're finding him for a condition we originally inherited?" Rachel answered before I could. "Correct." The discussion quickly shifted from accusing me to questioning each other. One director asked why no measurements had ever been documented. Another wondered who authorized referencing postal complaints. Diane insisted the board had acted in good faith, but the confidence she displayed at the beginning of the meeting had completely vanished. At one point, she looked directly at me and said, "Mr. Brooks, surely you understand we're only trying to preserve property values." I looked back at her for a moment before answering. "Property values aren't protected by making things up." The room fell silent again. Nobody objected because there wasn't much left to argue. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the hearing officer reviewed every document one final time before making his recommendation. "Based upon the evidence presented," he said carefully, "the association exceeded its enforcement authority regarding federally regulated mail delivery equipment. The violation should be dismissed immediately, all fines withdrawn, and the homeowner's record cleared." Diane stared down at the table without speaking. For the first time since this whole mess started, I realized the fight was already over. They just hadn't admitted it yet. To be continued in part 3. Walking out of that clubhouse, I expected to feel triumphant, maybe even a little smug after everything the board had put me through. But the truth is I mostly felt tired. The mailbox was still standing exactly where it had always stood. The desert breeze still rattled the little metal flag the same way it had for 16 years. And yet somehow the entire neighborhood felt different. Word traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. Before dinner that evening, my phone had already buzzed half a dozen times. My next-door neighbor, Mark, texted first. "Did you really beat them?" I replied with one sentence. "I didn't beat anyone. I just asked them to follow the law." The following week, the association quietly emailed every homeowner. The violation against my property had been rescinded, every fine had been canceled, and the enforcement action had been withdrawn from my permanent record. They never admitted they were wrong. Of course, organizations almost never do. Instead, they used phrases like administrative review and procedural clarification, the kind of language that sounds important while carefully avoiding the words "we made a mistake." Still, everyone knew exactly what had happened. People started stopping me during evening walks, not to congratulate me, but to tell me their own stories. One couple had paid hundreds of dollars because their basketball hoop supposedly violated community standards. An elderly widow said she'd replaced perfectly healthy shrubs after receiving repeated warning letters because she couldn't afford an attorney to fight back. Another neighbor admitted he'd simply paid every fine the board ever sent because he assumed they knew the law better than he did. That conversation stayed with me longer than the hearing itself. It made me realize the biggest weapon some organizations have isn't authority. It's the assumption that nobody will question it. About a month later, I ran into one of the former board members at the grocery store. He recognized me immediately and walked over with an awkward smile. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "not everyone agreed with how your case was handled." I looked at him for a second before answering. Then why didn't anyone say something? He sighed the way people do when they already know the answer. Sometimes it's easier to go along than to be the next person sitting in that chair. I couldn't even be angry with him because he was probably telling the truth. A few weeks after that, rumors started circulating that the association's legal bills had climbed well past $15,000 by the time outside counsel finished reviewing everything. Those costs didn't come from some secret account. They came from the dues every homeowner paid, including mine. Ironically, the board had spent far more money defending an imaginary mailbox violation than they ever could have collected from my original fine. By early fall, Diane Mercer resigned as president. The official statement mentioned personal reasons, but around the neighborhood people whispered about lost confidence, closed-door meetings, and growing frustration among homeowners who wanted answers. I never celebrated her resignation because, honestly, that wasn't the point. Replacing one person doesn't automatically fix a culture where nobody feels comfortable asking simple questions. What mattered more was what happened afterward. The new board announced that every future violation notice would include the exact covenant being cited, supporting measurements whenever applicable, and an opportunity for homeowners to request clarification before fines could begin. That should have been the policy all along. Every now and then, I still catch myself looking at that mailbox when I pull into the driveway after work. It's funny how an ordinary object can become a reminder of something much bigger. Most people see painted wood, a metal door, and a street number. I see the moment I stopped assuming that every official-looking letter deserved automatic obedience. I learned that confidence isn't raising your voice in a meeting or trying to embarrass the other side. Real confidence is quietly gathering facts, asking honest questions, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about a mailbox. It was about accountability. It was about the difference between leadership and control. Most importantly, it reminded me that laws exist for a reason, and no neighborhood committee, no matter how convinced it is of its own importance, gets to rewrite them simply because nobody pushes back. If I'd paid the fine without asking questions, nothing would have changed. The next homeowner would have received another orange envelope, then another after that, until everyone accepted something that was never legal in the first place. Maybe that's the lesson I hope people take away from all this. Stand up for yourself, but do it with facts instead of anger. Know the rules before you argue about the rules, and never confuse confidence with authority because those two things are very different. Now I'm genuinely curious what you think. Was the HOA simply trying to protect the neighborhood and made an honest mistake? Or did they knowingly overstep their authority because they expected another homeowner to quietly pay the fine? If you had been in my position, would you have fought all the way to the end? Or would you have moved the mailbox just to make the problem disappear? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below because I'd really like to hear where you stand on this one. And if you've ever had an experience with an HOA, a city agency, or anyone else who tried to use power they didn't actually have, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you enjoy real stories like this, and I'll see you in the next one.